Maria Hernandez had never been one to let the weight of the world bring her down. She was strong, a single mother who had raised her 2 kids in the heart of Los Angeles. They lived in a modest home nestled on the edge of a neighborhood that had seen its fair share of struggles. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. The walls of their house held laughter, arguments, celebrations, and countless memories. A life built from nothing but love and hard work. Maria woke up every morning at 5 a.m. to prepare breakfast for her children, Sofia and Alejandro, making sure they had everything they needed before they left for school. Her routine was unbreakable, her resilience unmatched. Despite the hardships, late rent, bills piling up, and a car that barely ran, she always made sure her kids never felt the weight of her worries. They were her world, and she was determined to protect them from whatever the world might throw their way. But one day, the world did throw something at them that no one could have anticipated. It started as a faint haze in the sky, a smoke that didn't seem too concerning at first. Maria had seen fires in California before, the stories on the news of the wildfires burning miles away. It was part of life in Los Angeles, something that always seemed distant. But that evening, the air thickened. The winds picked up, and the smoke grew darker. The news alerts started flooding her phone. Fires had started in the hills to the north, and they were moving fast, far faster than anyone could have anticipated. By morning, the fire was no longer a distant threat. It was at their doorstep. Sirens blared as the winds drove the flames closer and closer to the neighborhood. Maria's heart raced as she packed their few belongings, trying to keep her panic in check. She grabbed whatever she could: important documents, a few photos, clothes, and her kids' favorite toys. It wasn't much, but it was all they could carry. They were evacuating, but where would they go? How could they escape the overwhelming, all-consuming fire that seemed to be devouring everything in its path? As she loaded her children into the car, the heat from the fire could already be felt in the air. The orange glow of the flames lit up the horizon, a terrifying reminder of the power they were up against. It wasn't just her home they were about to lose. It was everything they had ever known. And as Maria drove away, watching her neighborhood disappear in the rearview mirror, a fear she had never known settled deep inside her. But little did they know this was just the beginning. The road ahead would challenge their strength in ways they never could have imagined. Maria drove through the thick smoke, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she navigated the chaotic streets. The traffic was a nightmare. Cars piled up on both sides, the air filled with the acrid smell of burning wood and ash. People were fleeing, some frantic, some calm, but all with the same look of helplessness. Maria's heart pounded as she tried to stay focused, her mind racing with worry for her kids and the uncertain future ahead. As they neared the edge of the city, the streets were lined with makeshift shelters. Tents, RVs, and families gathered outside in the open, their belongings piled up next to them. The sight was overwhelming. The fire had displaced hundreds, if not thousands, of people, and there was no sign of relief in sight. The overwhelming heat had made it impossible to breathe properly, and the constant stream of sirens created a haunting soundtrack to the chaos around them. Maria stopped at a red light, her eyes scanning the scene around her. A group of people had gathered near a small, makeshift stand where a woman was handing out bottled water. She was middle-aged, wearing a faded shirt and a baseball cap, her hands working tirelessly to keep up with the demand. At first, Maria didn't think much of it, but something about the woman's calm demeanor in the middle of such madness caught her attention. The woman noticed Maria's gaze and smiled warmly. "Hey there, looks like you've had a long drive. You and the kids need some water?" Maria nodded gratefully, rolling down the window. "Yes, please. Thank you. It's been a rough morning." "Don't mention it," the woman replied, her voice gentle but strong. "You're not the only one. Everyone's in the same boat today." She handed Maria a few bottles of water, then glanced at her kids in the back seat. "Are you folks all right? Any other places to go?" Maria hesitated. "We don't know. We're just trying to get out of the smoke. We don't have anywhere else to go. We've lost everything." The woman's face softened with understanding, her eyes reflecting the weight of the situation. "I hear you. It's tough out here. But you're not alone. If you need somewhere to stay, we've got a shelter up ahead. We're working together, trying to help folks who've lost their homes. My name's Helen, by the way." Maria blinked, taken aback by Helen's offer. "A shelter?" she asked, a bit incredulously. "You're just handing out water and offering a shelter in the middle of this? How are you doing all this?" Helen smiled again, her eyes gleaming with quiet resilience. "Well, we're all doing what we can. People are pulling together. I've got a few supplies in my car, but it's not much. I used to work as a nurse, so I'm used to helping folks out when things go sideways. But really, it's just about offering a little kindness, right? That's what makes a difference." Maria couldn't help but feel the tears welling up in her eyes. She had been so caught up in the fear and uncertainty of the moment. But here was a stranger offering help without hesitation. "I don't even know what to say," Maria whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't even know us. But you're helping." Helen shrugged casually, as though it was no big deal. "It's nothing special. It's just what people do for each other when things get tough. We all need each other. If you're willing to trust people, we'll all get through this together." As Helen spoke, Maria realized that this woman, this stranger, had no expectations of recognition. She wasn't doing this for praise or profit. She was doing it because it was the right thing to do. It wasn't grand or flashy. She didn't have a fancy organization or big financial support behind her. It was just her, a few supplies, and a whole lot of heart. Helen handed Maria another bottle of water, then gestured toward the makeshift shelter. "It's just down the road. There are some people there who can help you figure things out. We've got blankets, food, and a safe place to sleep. You and your kids can rest there, at least for tonight." Maria nodded, feeling a sense of relief that she hadn't thought possible. She had thought she was alone in this struggle, but Helen's quiet strength and kindness made her feel like maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Maybe the fire had taken so much, but it hadn't taken away the humanity and generosity of the people who still cared. "Thank you, Helen," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've given me hope today. You've helped more than you know." Helen gave a small nod, her face filled with quiet pride. "You don't need to thank me. You just need to keep going. And remember, you're not alone. We're all in this together." As Maria drove off toward the shelter, the weight of her fears seemed to lighten a little. The fires had taken so much from them, her home, her security, and her sense of stability. But in the midst of it all, she had found something even more valuable: kindness, selflessness, and a sense of community that could never be destroyed by fire. And with that, Maria knew that, no matter how tough the road ahead might be, they would make it through. Because there were people like Helen, quiet heroes who didn't ask for anything in return, making sure they weren't alone. As Maria arrived at the makeshift shelter, the reality of the situation hit her again. She and her children had been spared from the flames, but they were now part of a sea of evacuees. People who had lost everything in the devastating fires, each carrying their own burden of fear and uncertainty. The shelter was filled with families sitting on blankets, children playing quietly, and volunteers moving around, handing out food and water. Maria tried to push down the overwhelming sense of helplessness that threatened to drown her. She had always prided herself on being strong for her children, always finding a way to make things work. But now, with everything lost, she wasn't sure where to turn. She took a deep breath and looked at Sofia and Alejandro, who were both sitting on the floor, staring blankly at the unfamiliar surroundings. They had been so brave, so quiet, but Maria knew they were scared. They didn't know what would happen next. They didn't understand why everything was gone. She wanted to reassure them, to tell them that everything would be okay, but she wasn't even sure what that meant anymore. Helen had been right about the shelter. It was a safe place, a temporary haven in the chaos. But as Maria watched families interact with one another, exchanging stories of their losses, her guilt only grew. She didn't belong here. She was a burden on these kind people who had already given so much. They didn't need to help her. She had been proud of her self-sufficiency before, the quiet dignity of managing on her own. But now that dignity felt like an anchor dragging her down. She had always believed that asking for help was a sign of weakness, But here she was, relying on the kindness of strangers. The internal struggle gnawed at her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, she had failed her children. They had been through so much in their short lives. Poverty, violence, and hardship. Maria had always tried to shield them from it, to keep their world as normal as possible. But now, in the face of this disaster, there was nothing she could do. Everything she had worked so hard to provide for them, security, stability, a place to call home, had been taken in an instant. She had failed them. Sofia looked up at her mother, her eyes wide with fear. "Mom, where are we going now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Maria felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't have an answer. She could lie and tell Sofia that everything would be okay, that they would rebuild and things would go back to normal. But she couldn't make that promise. All she could do was hold her daughter close and hope that somehow, they would find their way through this. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Are you all right?" Maria looked up and saw Helen standing in front of her, a gentle expression on her face. She hadn't even realized that Helen had come over. "I'm fine," Maria replied quickly, brushing a tear away from her cheek. She didn't want to seem weak. She didn't want to burden Helen with her pain. Maria hesitated. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to take care of them when I can't even take care of myself." Helen sat down beside her, unfazed by Maria's discomfort. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. You're doing the best you can, and that's enough." She paused, looking at the children. "They're lucky to have you. They've got their mother, and that's everything." Maria shook her head, the guilt still weighing heavily on her chest. "I don't feel lucky. I feel like I've failed them." Helen's eyes softened, her voice steady. "I get it, but sometimes we have to rely on others. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up. And you've been showing up for them their whole lives. This is just a bump in the road." Maria stared at the floor, unsure of how to respond. Helen's words were kind, but they felt like a foreign language to her. She wasn't used to depending on others. She had spent her whole life relying on her own strength, on the belief that she could overcome anything. But now, in the wake of this destruction, that belief felt like a lie. How could she keep going when everything she had worked for was gone? Helen's voice broke through her thoughts again. "I know it's hard, but look around you. You're not alone. We're all in this together. And sometimes that's enough to get us through." Maria looked up at Helen, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She didn't know if she was ready to embrace this new way of thinking. Relying on others was uncomfortable. But as she looked at her children, who were playing quietly with other kids at the shelter, she realized that maybe, just maybe, Helen was right. The kindness of strangers, the willingness to lean on each other, could be the very thing that helped them get through this. The weight in her chest didn't disappear, but it lightened just a little. For the first time, Maria realized that accepting help wasn't about weakness. It was about survival. It was about showing her children that, even in the darkest times, there was still hope. She wasn't alone, and neither were they. "I'm trying," Maria whispered, more to herself than to Helen. "I'm trying to do better for them." Helen nodded, her smile warm and reassuring. "And that's all you can do. The rest will come when it's time." One step at a time, Maria exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. It wasn't the perfect solution. It wasn't everything she wanted, but it was a start. She had always fought to protect her family on her own, but maybe it was time to realize that there was power in letting others help. Power in coming together, even when everything seemed lost. Maybe this disaster, this loss, was the beginning of something else, something new. And with that thought, Maria took the first step toward rebuilding, not just her home, but her understanding of what it truly meant to survive. Days passed, and Maria settled into the temporary rhythm of shelter life. She had always prided herself on maintaining control, on managing everything herself. But now, for the first time, she was learning to rely on others. The shelter was filled with people who had lost everything. Homes, memories, the life they once knew. Yet, despite the ashes of their lives scattered all around, there was a sense of unity in the air. People helped one another without question. Volunteers like Helen moved with a quiet purpose, ensuring everyone had what they needed, whether it was a meal, a safe place to sleep, or just someone to talk to. Helen, in particular, became a constant presence in Maria's life. Though Maria still struggled with the guilt of needing help, Helen's unwavering kindness had made a significant difference. Helen didn't just give supplies or offer comforting words. She provided a steadiness that Maria had been missing. She had been through her own share of hardship, yet she showed Maria a kind of resilience that wasn't based on independence, but on the quiet strength of community and compassion. One evening, as the sun began to set and the air cooled, Maria sat outside the shelter, her children playing nearby. She couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in such a short time. The fire had taken their home, their belongings, their sense of normalcy, but it hadn't destroyed their bond. She and Sofia and Alejandro were still standing, still fighting. But now they were doing it together, not just as a family but as part of something bigger. Helen sat beside her, as she often did in the evenings, offering comfort without asking anything in return. The two women shared a moment of silence, the kind that came with mutual understanding. Finally, Maria spoke, her voice a little softer than usual. "I don't know how to thank you, Helen. I didn't think I could make it through this, but your kindness. It's been everything." Helen smiled, her eyes reflecting a quiet strength. "You don't have to thank me, Maria. You're doing just fine. All you need to do is keep going. You're already doing that." But Maria's gaze lingered on Helen, feeling something more than gratitude. Over the past few days, she had seen the true power of community, of leaning on others, of accepting that there was no shame in needing help. Helen had shown her that strength wasn't always about standing alone. Sometimes, it came from standing together, sharing burdens, and lifting one another up when things seemed impossible. Maria had learned to let go of the weight she'd carried for so long, the belief that she had to do it all herself. She had learned that accepting help didn't diminish her worth as a mother or a person. It made her stronger, because it allowed her to heal, to recover, and to focus on what truly mattered, her children, and her ability to give them a future. As the days turned into weeks, the fire's destruction slowly faded from the immediate forefront of Maria's mind. It wasn't gone. Nothing could erase the trauma of what they had lost, but it was becoming a part of their story, not the whole story. They had found hope in the ashes, and they had learned that even in the most uncertain times, there were people who cared. One afternoon, Maria was sitting with Helen in the volunteer tent when a woman approached them. She was new to the shelter, a young mother with 2 young children in tow. Maria could see the look in the woman's eyes, the same fear, the same uncertainty that had been in her own eyes just a few weeks ago. Helen gave her a warm smile and stood up to offer the woman a chair. "You're not alone," she said gently. "We're here to help." Maria, instinctively, rose to her feet as well, walking over to the woman. She placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I know it seems like the world has fallen apart," she said softly, her voice filled with the wisdom she had gained through her own struggles. "But I've learned that when everything seems lost, you find strength in the people around you. You're stronger than you think, and you're not alone." The woman looked at Maria, her eyes filling with unshed tears. "But I don't know what to do. Everything's gone. My house, my job. I feel like I'm starting over with nothing." Maria nodded, understanding the overwhelming weight of the words. "I know how you feel," she said, her voice steady. "But sometimes starting over is the only way to build something better. And you don't have to do it alone. We're all here for you, just like I've had people here for me." Helen watched with a knowing look, a slight smile tugging at her lips. Maria was no longer just a recipient of help. She had become the one offering it. She had shifted from the woman who had first arrived at the shelter, broken and uncertain, to someone who could now offer hope, empathy, and strength to those who needed it. In that moment, Maria realized something fundamental. Her strength was no longer measured by her ability to handle everything on her own. It was measured by her ability to give back, to lift others when they needed it most, and to find light even in the darkest of times. She had been through the fire, literally and figuratively, and had come out the other side with a renewed understanding of what really mattered. Helen had been the first person to show Maria that kindness could heal even the deepest wounds. And now, Maria had become the embodiment of that kindness, passing it forward to others who needed it just as much. It wasn't just about rebuilding homes. It was about rebuilding lives, together. And Maria knew, without a doubt, that the strength of community, of shared humanity, would always be the foundation upon which they built their future. As the shelter buzzed with activity, Maria smiled at Helen, a deep sense of gratitude welling up in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. But this time, it was more than just for her own sake. It was for the entire community, for the shared strength that would guide them through whatever came next. "Thank you for showing me what it really means to be strong." Helen nodded, her smile the only answer needed. "It's all of us, Maria. We're all in this together." And for the first time since the fire, Maria believed it. As the sun set over the shelter, casting a golden light across the tents and makeshift homes, Maria sat quietly with Sofia and Alejandro beside her. The day had been filled with small moments of hope, small victories in the face of devastation. People had begun to rebuild, not just their homes, but their spirits. The sense of community, the willingness to support one another in the darkest of times, had made all the difference. Maria looked at her children, their faces more relaxed now, smiles starting to return. They were slowly finding their footing again. Though they had lost so much, they had found something they hadn't expected: strength in each other, and in the people who had offered them kindness. She had once believed that strength came from standing alone, from bearing the weight of the world on her shoulders. But now, she understood that true strength came from the willingness to lean on others, to accept help, and to offer it in return. She turned to Helen, who was sitting a few feet away, talking quietly with another family. The sense of gratitude Maria felt toward this woman was impossible to put into words. Helen's unwavering support had shown her a side of life she hadn't seen before. She had learned that sometimes, the greatest gift we can offer is not what we do for others, but the way we show up for them when they need it the most. As Maria watched Helen interact with the families, offering them reassurance, Maria found herself smiling. It wasn't just the shelter they had found in this time of crisis. It was the human connection, the kindness that had allowed them to stay strong when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Maria had come here feeling broken, uncertain about what the future held. But now, she felt a quiet, steady sense of hope. Turning back to her children, she spoke softly, her voice filled with a newfound peace. "We've been through a lot, haven't we? But I think we're going to be okay. Because no matter what, we have each other. And we have good people around us, people who are willing to help." Sofia looked up at her mother, her eyes bright. "We're going to make it, right, Mom?" Maria smiled, her heart swelling with love for her children. "Yes, sweetie, we are. We have everything we need to start over. And that's enough." As the evening settled into a peaceful quiet, Maria realized that the true measure of resilience wasn't in what we can rebuild alone, but in the way we come together, the way we help one another rise. And in that understanding, she knew that no matter what the future held, they would always have the strength to move forward, together. And that was all that really mattered.